and welcome back to another episode of the GDL podcast. I'm going to be your host today, Jayant or Jay Uppal. I'm actually new to the GDL podcast hosting community, and this is going to be the first episode in a new series called Growing Pains. Now, my aim with Growing Pains is really to demystify some of the things around the business side of games, which is where most of my experience is within. I think, especially when you're first starting out, it can be quite hard to understand sort of the global scale of the games industry and especially the business elements there. So I really hope this podcast journey is going to be quite helpful for a lot of you in terms of understanding what's been happening in the industry, where we have been in the past, where we are now, and where we're going to be going in the future. And to do this, I plan to speak with a lot of industry leaders across the game dev, game publishing, and game tech side of things to really understand from a leadership perspective what is it that they've been seeing in the game space over the last few years and where they're really targeting to go next. As part of that journey, this first episode, I'm going to be joined by Devan Brennan, who is the senior consultant over at Newzoo. Newzoo is one of the premier agencies within the games industry that specifically looks at the data analytics side of things within the PC console side. And they've recently just published their big global games market report that looks at the highline trends in terms of what's been shaping the industry, but then also looking at where we're going to be going and what's going to be driving that growth. So it's a super informative podcast today, I think. I definitely know I learned a lot from Devan. He brought a lot of interesting facts to the table. So I hope that you really enjoy this podcast that we've put together for you. And as always, if you do have any questions around any of the things that we discuss, feel free to get in touch with myself or with Devan around that. I think our social will be included in the description below. And finally, Devan is also quite a proficient business developer, having been critical to a lot of Newzoo's success over the last few years. And towards the end of this podcast, I think in about the last 30 minutes, he actually dives into some of the top tips that he has for business development around the games industry, specifically looking at a global scale there. So I think there's a lot of valuable information in this podcast. And if you do want to learn a bit more about business development, definitely stick to the end for that. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed the podcast, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Growing Pains. Thanks again for joining. You're officially on the first ever Growing Pains podcast here. And my first ever guest on as a podcast host. So how does it feel to be here?
It's an honor. I feel a little bit of pressure. It's a scary prospect to be the first, but hopefully I can live up to the expectations. But no, I'm really excited to be here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. I think we're going to cover a lot of really interesting topics.
Yeah, we have a lot to get through today, and don't worry. Even though it's my first podcast, it's like episode 210 or 211 or something. So there's a big backlog to get through before you get to this anyway.
Nice.
But yeah. So before we get into all that, I just wanted to get a bit of an introduction to you, Devan. You know, your background, a bit about Newzoo, the consulting side. I was always asked, what does the consulting team do? I don't know if I ever had a good answer for that, but maybe you can set me right on that now.
I might disappoint on that angle, but so before Newzoo, I was a much more boring version of a consultant at Deloitte, and before that, I was pursuing a startup in the game space to help with indie discoverability. But now I'm at Newzoo we're encroaching on 4 years now. I started more on the business development side, but now recently I've been working with the consulting team, primarily supporting different game developers and publishers on their commercial strategy. So everything from building a revenue forecast to doing game teardowns, market assessments, TAM assessments, basically any important question that folks are asking, we're trying to solve it. Yeah.
Yep. Pretty much what I also did, I guess.
Yeah, consistent.
The answer hasn't changed much.
Familiar. Yeah.
Yeah.
If it ain't broke, don't fix it, I guess.
Exactly. Well, I don't know. Was it broke? I think from what I've heard, you guys have been doing really good right now. Like I said, non-stop projects, non-stop work these days.
It's been busy. My sleep schedules look a little rough some days, but it's been a lot of fun, so I can't complain too much.
Yeah, it's always a good time. So, I mean, any good things this year? Any good projects? Any stuff you want to share in terms of what you've been up to?
I mean, it's always a tricky one. A lot of these projects are very confidential, and people are not.
All
It's a very
NDA'd.
opaque industry, right? People don't really love you talking about things that are not in the public eye yet. I think we're just doing interesting work around with some of the new startups that have come into the COVID space. I think a lot of them are going to face pretty challenging headwinds, which we can talk on
Yeah.
later. But a lot of them are also doing some really interesting innovation around gameplay and genre blending. So being able to see and work with a lot of those folks has probably been my personal highlight so far.
Nice. No, that's good. And I've also seen you've been making a lot of the circuits around the conferences and speaking to a lot of people in the industry. I mean, on that, obviously, you kind of mentioned a little bit, but we've had a bit of a tough year, or tough almost 2 years now, I guess, 1.5. What is sort of your thought on the industry right now? What's been happening, obviously, with Newzoo having oversight into everything on data analytics? What's your view on what brought us here, where we're going, just kind of roughly in a big picture kind of way?
I mean, in a big picture, I'm very positive, to be honest. We have had a very difficult couple of years, and I think the reality of that was COVID sort of created this bubble of players that got slapped on top of our industry within a very short period in time. It ended up showing some growth graphs that I guess many executives and people who were building their forecasts thought were continual growth graphs forecasted out into the future, and started doing project plans, employment plans, budgeting based off of the foundation or the idea, the assumption that these are going to be the growth rates out till say 2028. For many people, it might have been pretty easy to call that those were not going to be the growth rates. We were not going to experience double-digit growth over the next few years. And now we're seeing the result of that planning and the lack of forethought. And unfortunately, of course, a lot of the folks, the little guys, the developers, designers, producers, they're the ones who are feeling the pain from that situation. So that sucks. But on a big picture, if we look at before COVID and where we're headed now, we're essentially just back to where we expected we to be at this time without the impact of COVID, and on a positive growth trajectory. So overall, I'm quite positive. I think we've corrected coming out of those mistakes during COVID, and I think overall we're hopefully heading to a healthier place for the industry.
Nice. So no more incursions from the metaverse and all of that.
I mean, we could touch on the metaverse, we could touch on blockchain and these types of things. I have many thoughts, but no, I don't think we're going to see massive incursions from those types of buzzwords, at least in the next 3 to 5 years.
Okay, so maybe longer term, huh?
Well, not the blockchain part, but maybe the metaverse. Yeah.
I don't know. I know a lot of people that are still excited about NFTs, right? They're still going strong. Mythical's trying to bring
I
it in.
appreciate their commitment, but I do not share their excitement.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we'll leave that for another time. I think let's go kind of deeper into jump in. So just for reference for the listeners, this podcast is going to be split into a few different parts. The first part, we're going to go over Newzoo. We're going to go over sort of the new report that you guys have just published, into the big trends that you're seeing in the next year or coming years, and what's kind of brought us there, which we've already started touching on now. And in the back half, I also wanted to get your sort of tips and view on biz dev, because like you said, you've also done that a lot. And I think, if I'm not mistaken, he's still the only person to crack 1 million at Newzoo.
In new business, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, very, very valuable tips, I'm sure, from that. So yeah, let's start first with global kind of market trends, where we are right now, and obviously based on the projects that you've been doing as well with people. We can dive into some of the trends in a bit. I've already looked at the free report. I haven't memorized it yet. It's only been like a day since it's been out, but I think there's a lot of good stuff there, a lot of good content, and it kind of feels weird because this is the first time I'm seeing it as like a viewer from the other side.
Yeah.
So it's it's fascinating to be just a reader instead of a contributor this time. But yeah, so big numbers, big things. You've already kind of said you're positive on where the industry's going. We've kind of corrected for a lot of what happened during COVID with the pump in numbers. Would you say it's following kind of a similar line as pre-COVID, or do we still have a bit more of a bump because of the COVID entrance? Especially as like I think a big trend that I've seen in general is that games is becoming essentially a mainstream form of media now. Before that, I think there was a lot of talk about, games is untouchable. We've always seen growth, even during financial crisis and all of that. And I think, in my part, I think a lot of that is just because it was a niche. Back then, mobile wasn't a thing back in the financial crisis days, and now, especially with new people, with I think Newzoo's latest report saying it's almost like 3.5 billion players, like about 40% of the whole world's audience can essentially be classified as a gamer. So yeah, give me some overview in terms of like the whole market. Why are you positive? What's the numbers showing? Where are we?
Yeah, absolutely. So as you said, we're surpassing 3.4 billion players in 2024, which is just, I mean, you got to kind of stop for a second and go like, holy moly, that is an insane number. And we expect that 3.4 billion players to translate into roughly 187 billion in spending on games. So the actual purchase of games, in-game spending, multi-game subscriptions, that'll be around 187 billion in 2024. So absolutely monstrous numbers. And within that, so that's roughly a 2% year over year growth. So very modest levels of growth. And I think a comparison point that's interesting is in the 3 years leading up to COVID, so 2017, 2018, and 2019, the cumulative annual growth rate was roughly 4.9%. So that's before the impact of COVID, or a little under 5% growth rate. So of course, the 2% growth we're projecting for this year is notably lower. So we're not on the same acceleration of growth really within the industry, but we are growing. And actually, when we look past 2024, we expect that growth level to increase a bit further. But before I get to that, maybe we touch a little bit on some of the specific segments within 2024. So I'll highlight mobile for the mobile devs listening in here. Positive news. We're actually of the belief that mobile will be returning to growth this year. So mobile has actually been shrinking the past 2 years. Of course, privacy changes coupled with the difficult economic situation across the globe has really hit mobile, arguably the hardest of any of the 3 major segments. But this year we expect around a 3% year over year growth. This is driven by the improving economic situation in several different global economies, the strong performance of many heavy hitters. So Monopoly Go, for example, they very notably passed $1 billion mark last year. This year, they're now, Scopely has already said they've hit the 3 billion mark this year. Monstrous game. Another one, DNF Mobile, released in China only from Tencent, within the first few months has surpassed $500 million in sales. It seems like it'll coast to the $1 billion mark this year as well. So there's some really high performing heavy hitters that are really boosting the overall mobile market too.
And then on the mobile market, are you seeing it still kind of quite divergent in terms of what's working in the West and the East? Is it still, because obviously it was a lot bigger in the Asia market just by, purchasing power of the people in terms of it being more accessible as a platform. But are you seeing that split still there in terms of the types of games that work, in terms of the revenues and the engagement? Or is it kind of starting to converge a little bit more across the West and East now?
There's some convergence. So like there's titles that are bridging the gap, like Genshin is bridging the gap. Honkai is doing that a bit. But I think there's still quite a significant divergence. Like Monopoly Go is primarily, their biggest spenders are in the US, and that's where most of their revenue is coming from. They're not cracking the East in the same way like a DNF Mobile or several other titles. So there's a pretty large discrepancy between what is driving revenue on mobile based on the geographies. And I'm not sure when we look to the future that will change anytime soon. I think the play needs and play expectations, also certain IPs are just more popular in each of those markets. And I think that will probably remain fairly steady over the next few years.
Okay, fair enough. And then I know one of the big trends was on mobile in the report as well. Do you want to dig into that now, or still go over the overview and dig into that when we get to the trend side?
Well, we could touch on it now. I think it makes sense. It
Yeah.
was discussing the mobile ecosystems opening up, right?
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, this is a fun topic. There's a lot of legal
Yeah,
news,
yeah. This is
and
like a whole podcast in itself, I think,
yeah,
right?
yeah. There's a lot of that. There's probably people far smarter on the legal and mobile monetization side of this that are better. But just broadly speaking, for those unfamiliar, mobile ecosystems are planned to open up due to regulatory pressures from different regulation bodies in Europe and North America that are essentially forcing iOS and Android stores to allow for third-party stores and other payment options on their platform. This is most notably going to cause the return of Fortnite, which has been off of mobile platforms for quite a long time now. That will actually also helpfully boost the overall mobile performance. But it's really a massive question mark whether or not these introduction of third-party stores are going to be successful. Like you need to break such an established habit of consumers in order to get them into these third-party stores. And Apple is going to be doing everything within their power, even maybe what shouldn't be in their power, to restrict users from getting to these third-party stores. So I think it's a really a massive question mark in the mobile space, how this is going to impact the overall mobile experience.
Yeah, I mean, to have a platform, have a store like that, you need to have a lot of power already, right? So only like Microsoft, Samsung, like the big players that actually have a pretty big stake in the market can fight against Apple and Google like that. And I think Apple's still fighting hard in the US to prolong as much as they can. I think they've sort of lost the battle a little bit in Europe with the law coming out, in the UK as well. But I mean, despite all that, you think it's a positive sign for mobile. People are going to have a little bit more in terms of options, and I guess at the end of the day, these platforms, the new app stores, new people will have better routes for monetization. But do you see that helping sort of the more indie mobile devs, or do you think it's still on platform side just going to be from the major players mostly?
Yeah, I actually do think this could be a very positive situation for the mid to lower tier mobile developer space. As it stands right now, discoverability on these platforms is so incredibly difficult. So if there are third-party storefronts that are able to gain a reasonable install base of users, they could provide much better discoverability to these smaller apps or smaller developer apps and games, which could be a great outcome for a lot of that market. Because right now, what we see is a significant concentration of both revenue and engagement within the top titles in each genre, and that's a very difficult ecosystem for newer and smaller developers to try to compete in.
Cool. Well, sounds good. I guess we'll have to see how this all plays out in the next couple of years. I know I used to work in mobile, and there was a lot like when I was doing UA, the IDFA had just come in, and then everyone was like, "Oh no, it's the end of mobile." And then you had all the plugins and the workarounds, and it's been like a constant shift almost every other year with the privacy things. So hopefully this is finally actually bringing some clarity in terms of what's going to happen there. But yeah, let's see. I think in terms of like side loading or getting people to have other platforms, that's already very common in Asia, right? That market already
Mhm.
kind of runs on having side loading and having these third party app stores. So there's definitely lessons in terms of where it can be successful. And yeah, I guess we just got to hope that the West kind of catches up with that.
Yeah, the Western gamers
The,
can be quite lazy. I know from personal experience. So
yeah,
hopefully they're able to break our play patterns and get us onto those third-party stores. I 100% agree on the Asian markets. That's a great point.
yeah, that sounds good. And then, yeah, did you want to go onto the PC console side? What are you seeing there?
Yeah, so let's touch on that from a bit of a macro perspective. So console is actually the one segment that's having a down year in 2024. We're actually forecasting a 1% shrinkage in the overall console market. The reality for console is it's the segment that is most dependent on having a strong slate of AAA releases. to drive the overall revenue of the segment. And 2024 is a fairly light year overall. So that's why we expect the segment to be performing the worst of the three segments. And contrasting that, PC is actually the segment that we expect to be the fastest growing of the three, with a 4% year-over-year growth. PC is kind of a fun segment because now it has such a stable base of live service revenues coming from League of Legends, Valorant, Counter-Strike, Dota. All of these very core live service titles provide a very predictable source of revenue that's quite stable. And then on top of that, the cross-platform strategies from Xbox and PlayStation are providing massive benefits to PC as their first-party IP are getting ported over to PC, mostly PlayStation at this point, and that's providing kind of a strong boost to the overall PC segment from a revenue perspective.
Yeah. Okay. And then on that kind of console convergence for PG, do you think Game Pass is dead? Are we at that point where they're kind of just sticking on straws at this point?
Gonna get me in trouble with that question. Do I think Game Pass is dead? I mean, so short answer is no. I don't think Game Pass is dead. Do I believe in the thesis of a multi-game subscription service? I don't, because I think that the play patterns of gaming are so different than the consumption patterns of other media types that I think it's somewhat of a flawed hypothesis. But is it dead? No. And we'll really have to see how the Call of Duty launch goes. What level of upfront sales do they cannibalize by being day one on Game Pass? What is the subscriber bump from that move? Does that trade-off make sense? Are they then able to retain those subscribers after their bump in November, or do they quickly leave after they've experienced whatever single-player content Call of Duty decides to release this year, right? So I think this winter period is a big moment for Game Pass. My expectation is we're going to start to see them really pull back from the day one on Game Pass type launches. And we've already sort of seen that where they're introducing a tier that doesn't have the day one launches and the advertising tier as well. So I think they're really trying to pivot Game Pass from what the original vision of it was. So it'll be interesting to see how that performs.
Yeah.
Was that a politically correct enough answer? Well, I get Microsoft mad at me for that one.
I think you're fine. I think you're fine. I couldn't take anything away from that. I think everyone knows that they are in a bit of a place right now. They're in a bit of a place trying to figure out what's happening. I think the best news that came out of Microsoft in recent days was that Crofton bought up Tango GameWorks. That was pretty much the only thing that I've seen. I'm like, yeah,
no comment to that one.
Some hope in the industry.
And I'll build on that a little bit. I'll build on the Xbox side of things a little bit as well. So for people's reference, everyone knows Xbox has had two very difficult generations, from Xbox One to Xbox Series S and X. They have not performed great from an active install base. The active install base for Xbox is roughly half where PlayStation is at the moment. So that is a pretty substantial drop off in active users on their platform. And so for them, this cross-platform strategy is almost a necessity to make sure they're reaching a broad enough audience to actually justify their investments in software. Now, as we look to the future, what I really hope is that Microsoft and Xbox are coming up with a creative next generation console that's not just a technological leap forward. Because I'm quite concerned if that's all the next Xbox generation is, then I have a tough time forecasting that would be successful. But let's say, fun prediction, Xbox does the copying homework of the Nintendo Switch and brings forward a generation that has the dual capacity of at-home play and portable play. We already know Spencer has alluded to the fact that they're interested in handheld play, basically confirmed that they're planning some type of handheld, and their commitment to play anywhere kind of makes sense to try to go after this sort of dual capacity console play, and you now get to take your Game Pass at home and on the road with you in one device. So if they're trying to become creative with the next generation, I can see pathways back for them. But I feel like they need to be thinking about more creative solutions to try to bring back an install base, bring back players into their ecosystem.
Yeah, and then I mean, what do you think in terms of just the future of console now that exclusives are moving over to PC? We're having that convergence. Do you think there's still a place for convergence? For consoles, like I know PS5's still been doing well, but it's definitely slower than what the PS4 had. PCs are becoming more prevalent, like you said. There's more people moving to that side. So, what is the future for console? Do you think there's still going to be a market for that in the long term? Or are we slowly seeing those filter out?
I think we'll definitely see another generation. Will we see another generation after the next generation? That one's a tougher question. Um, it's fun. As you think historically, PC has kind of always been seen as the pinnacle of the platforms, right? You'll never hear someone say, I'm upgrading from my PC to an Xbox. Like that doesn't happen. Gamers don't say that. So PC's always been seen as that pinnacle of the platform space. And always the biggest drawback is 10 years ago, if you only had a PC, you couldn't play Halo or you couldn't play The Last of Us, right? But nowadays, you can play any game. We even looked at the top 200 titles by monthly active users in 2024, and only 11 of them are not available on PC. And 7 of those titles are PlayStation exclusive titles, most of which will come to PC within the next 2 years. So you basically, if you own a PC, you have access to all of the content on top of all the other benefits of a PC, like the utility of a PC outside of gaming, access to emulators, which have become very popular for retro gaming. Yes. You now have the Steam Deck, which allows you to take your Steam library on the go. So you have there's so much additional benefit to the PC platform. And now there's no longer any drawback other than the cost of the PC. So that's the one area where consoles have some leverage over PC is you can get more processing power, more computing power for less with a console.
Yeah, so it's really just that kind of ease of access and money more than anything else. But we are definitely seeing a bit of a change, right? Like I think, like you said, PC is the only one that was growing a lot more compared to console, anyways. So I mean, I guess we'll have to see. We'll have to see what the next console generation brings. And I mean, on that, what are your thoughts on the Switch 2?
Oh yeah, this is a fun conversation because Nintendo is just a fun company.
Yeah.
So the Nintendo, for people listening, the Nintendo Switch has the largest active install base of any of the consoles at the moment, by a small margin, by a pretty decent margin over PlayStation. So they've arguably been the most successful of the 3 console manufacturers in this generation. So when you forecast to the future, you might be quite optimistic on what the Switch 2 will do. But let's look at the history of Nintendo for a second. Their ability to transition players between similar generations, at least recently, has been a bit of a struggle. I think a lot of people will remember the Wii to Wii U situation was not great. So the track record here, a bit spotty. The other thing I'll highlight is the Switch was actually the most benefited platform of the 3 consoles for COVID, because COVID introduced a very large bubble of casual players into the gaming ecosystem. And casual players, of course, gravitate to the Switch over the other consoles. So it saw the biggest bump from COVID. Those market dynamics do not exist. Well, should knock on wood. Those market dynamics will probably not exist in 2025. So they will not have that benefit. A lot of those casual players have, stepped away from gaming or are very lightly engaging with the space and are very unlikely to buy a new console, especially since they still have the Switch. So there are a lot of market factors here that are potentially going to show signs of difficulties for Switch. On a positive side, they have said that they're not going to have supply issues. They have said that they have enough stock to avoid scalpers. So I mean, will that happen? Hopefully it does. I really hope for everyone excited for the Switch 2 that they're able to buy one at MSRP the day of its release. But that's also a big question mark as well. But at least there's no massive GPU crush happening at the moment or anything like that.
Yeah.
So I do think they'll probably be able to figure that out. But it'll be very interesting to see. We also know nothing about the Switch 2. We know some rumors that it might just be like a tech boost on what the Switch is. But we actually don't
OLED
know
screen.
exactly. Yeah, another OLED screen. Please no.
Yeah, no, I mean, maybe at Gamescom. Maybe at Gamescom. We are kind of getting close to that end of year launch, so I'm hoping something, whether it's Gamescom or DGS, they bring something out. But yeah, I mean, on Nintendo, I think, at least for me, one of the things that still makes it stand out is it's the only kind of platform owner that hasn't moved to PC. They're still tightly gripping onto their IP, still kind of trying to milk it all for all it's worth. And the discounting strategy, that's like the one platform where they don't really do anything there. Do you think that's going to be enough going forward, those strategies to keep players involved, keep them coming into the ecosystem?
Yeah, I think so. I think it's hard to forecast a scenario. I mean, it's been so consistently successful for the last few, basically 2 decades at this point. Their strength of IP is some of the best in the business. Their transmedia strategy has been incredibly successful. Like the Mario movie actually helped them open up markets that they had historically underperformed in, like Latin America. They saw a notable boost in Switch sales in Latin America as a result of the Mario movie. And that's the effectiveness of this transmedia strategy at play. So that IP strength is so fundamental, and people there's old folks like us with nostalgia for that IP, and there's young folks coming in who are now watching Mario movie 12 times a week, driving their parents insane, and they now want to play those Mario games as well. So like they have both sides of the market. They have incredibly strong IP. They provide a great platform to play those games on. So it's hard to forecast that changing anytime within the next 10 years.
Fair enough. And then so yeah, we've done Xbox and Switch now. Any words on PlayStation and Sony?
Yeah, PlayStation, Sony. I mean, they're a very interesting one. So I mentioned earlier that they have double the active install base of Xbox. So I think overall they've been performing quite well throughout these last generations. They do have a problem. They really don't have a live service game plan. I did a little analysis on 2023 from a playtime perspective, based on the largest publishers in their first-party titles. Microsoft captured roughly 20% of playtime across PC, PlayStation, and Xbox with their first-party games. PlayStation was around 4% of playtime in the market. So when we're talking about a play, and that is the live service gap. Really, all they have is Destiny, which has been having obviously notable struggles, and now they have Helldivers, although they don't actually own Arrowhead Studios, and they have a slate of live service titles. Concord is the most the soonest one up to bat. Initial signs have not been great for Concord. I played it myself. Yeah. It's a fun game. I have big concerns about how that's going to launch and how it's going to perform. So their big issue is, well, there are 2 issues. One, their live service slate has not looked great, but they have time there. The other side is how well are they going to be able to transition to the next generation? Because I think it'll be very interesting to see if the delayed launch single player style is enough of an incentive to push PS5 players who have a PC at the moment or who will get access to a PC within the next 5 years to become PS6 or whatever they call it owners. Because I'm not convinced. I own a PS5 and a PC. I will probably not be buying a PS6 because I'm just going to be a PC player going forward. For me, there's no reason now to own the next generation of PlayStation consoles. And so I think that's a big question mark, is can they keep players in their ecosystem of consoles over the next 10 years? And I'm not sure they'll be able to do that.
Yeah, no, especially that's the drawback, I guess. If going cross-platform, it may give you new audiences, but can also cannibalize the existing ones a little bit.
Yeah,
Cool. So
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely.
cool. So I think we've covered the top lines. Do you want to dive into the big trends from the latest report?
Let's do it. Where do you want to start?
Let's do it. I mean, we can just start from the top. I think we've done the mobile one essentially, so it's just the
Yeah.
other seven. I think the start with the cross-platform releases benefiting PC. I think PC is still one that we can dive into a little bit more. Like you said, it's growing, but yeah, what about the cross-platform and its benefits to PC? I guess a lot of that's coming from mobile users, mobile moving producers and devs moving across to PC. What is that? What is that trend?
So it's a little bit on what we touched on earlier with the PC being kind of benefiting from these console exclusive franchises coming over. There are some mobile franchises coming over. Those have not performed super well for the most part. They're not a big
Hmm.
growth drivers for the space. It really is those first party console franchises coming to PC. And to give you some numbers here, around a little over half of the PC player base, based on our consumer research, do not play on consoles. So they're PC players or they're PC and mobile players, not PC and console players. So that is a fairly sizable chunk of players who are patient, and they're now getting access to so much content that in the past they have been locked out of. And it's this share that, as a result of these cross-platform strategies, as we look to the future, we expect that share to probably grow over the next 10 years as well.
Nice. And then do you think with everything kind of going cross-platform, PC, mobile, all of this, do you think mobile devs have opportunities now to build new IPs, build that around PC specifically, or do you think the dev space is still going to be relatively, different in terms of what's happening? Because I know like Supercell's been looking into maybe expanding onto PC. A couple other mobile-only developers are now looking outside the ecosystem, especially with sort of all the privacy regulations, the changes with how they can target and do UA, and there's AppsFly has also started to open that ecosystem up in terms of bringing UA to PC console, especially from a live ops service. So do you think we're going to see more mobile devs build PC only games or go towards the PC side?
Yeah, absolutely. 100% it's happening. I think there are a few different ways in which folks are approaching it. There are the mobile devs who are thinking they can just port their mobile titles directly onto PC. I'll be honest, I don't think that's a winning strategy. We haven't seen any data to suggest that is a winning strategy. The only
Yeah.
benefit you can get from that is a bit more engagement out of your existing player base, because now they can play the game on a few different platforms, and that might have a marginal increase on conversion. But overall, I wouldn't say that's a winning strategy. What I do think of the winning strategy is mobile developers leveraging their experience and building full either PC or console titles. I mean, we saw this already with Shift Up, the Korean developer who just actually went through an IPO. They have Nikkei, which Nikkei did fantastic. It's they call it a subculture game. I won't dive
Yeah.
into that too much. Those that know, they know what I'm talking
I know.
about. But that game funded Stellar Blade, which was
Yeah.
actually a PlayStation exclusive title, but it performed very well. And so it's this approach that I think will be the most successful. But having the skill set to be both a mobile game developer and a PC console developer, I think it's quite unusual that mobile developers have kind of the base of skills to translate over to being a PC console developer. But saying that, they also have different genre experiences. So we've seen cozy games being growing on PC and console. There's a massive market of female players in PC and console, which is a demographic that mobile developers serve much better than PC console developers do. So it's those experiences. I would love to see these mobile developers bring new genres, expand genres that we currently have in the space to try and access a more broader demographic than what the current PC console developers serve at the moment.
Nice. Yeah. No, I mean, I remember I played Spiritfarer pretty recently, kind of on the cozy game side. It's so good.
Great game.
Definitely want
Great game.
more things like that. Yeah. So hopefully, if you're a mobile dev out there, don't just put your match three game. Probably won't work, but try and build something good for the PC console players. Cool. The next trend actually I'm really interested in because it is something that is happening a lot in games. I remember I think you had a little bit, and this is about the right sizing of games. How long should
Mm.
they be exactly? I've been a JRPG player for most of my life, and I think pretty much going back as far as possible, those games end up being like your Final Fantasy campaigns were never short.
Yeah.
But I just finished Rebirth, and I ended up spending almost 100 hours there. Persona 5 is one of my all-time favorite games, but that was like
Oh God.
120
How many
hours.
hundreds of hours do you have in Persona
Yeah,
at this
yeah,
point?
exactly.
I want to know.
I mean, I've replayed it. I've replayed it like three times. So I think I've got at least because you had Persona 5, then you had the remake,
Yeah.
and then I
Yeah.
played those both like twice. So I think at least 400 to 500 hours at this point on just that game.
Yeah.
And I know Baldur's Gate as well, kind of a similar thing, right? Where we were going on the hundreds of hours
Yes.
campaigns.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
I'm at 150 hours in PG on my campaign. Yeah.
nice.
Yeah.
You've also done it a couple of times now as well, right?
Yeah, I'm starting my second playthrough at the moment with the hard mode or the extra hard mode.
Yeah.
Painful, but it's so much fun.
Yeah. So I think, I mean, RPGs and sort of live games are already, they have a bit of an exception. They've kind of built this up. But we're seeing other games follow that trend as well. Your Elden Rings, more of sort of the action adventure games. We're going from, 5 hour campaigns, which was like, I think Modern Warfare 4 had that kind of thing, all the way to 20, 30, 40 plus hours now. So do games need to be that long? Does the player base really have that much time, especially as I think in the PC console report it was what 8% of total playtime goes to new games. So is there a market for long games? Do people prefer the short things? I know like I really enjoyed Stray, I really enjoyed Miles Morales, having a short like 5 to 10 hour campaign. I'm like, okay, I can just smash this out in a weekend and I don't need to worry about it. Yeah, what is the right size for a game today?
I love this topic. And before I answer the question, let's talk a little bit of like the context of what's happening here.
Yeah.
Like cast your mind back 15 years ago. The gaming space was quite different, and the entertainment space as a whole was quite different. Like the options you had was I'll go to Blockbuster to rent a movie, I'll watch maybe some Let's Plays on YouTube, or I'll watch cable television. Like those were my entertainment options, or I'll play video games. And in that ecosystem, people were far more concerned of dollar per hour. Like how many hours of gameplay am I going to get for every dollar I spend on this game? Like if you would go to the first or basically any critic review of a game, the first thing that would be said is like, how long is the game? Like that was the first kind of point of quality control, is how long is the title? Fast forward to today, the entertainment ecosystem is so different. Like you have so much cheap entertainment accessible to everybody, like Netflix content libraries, Twitch, TikTok, YouTube, Audible, swiping on Tinder. Like the amount of available entertainment for very cheap to consumers is colossally different than it was, say, 15 years ago. And so, with that framework, we actually, I think, need to be respecting players' times because people aren't spending that same amount of time in one game. They're not as worried about the game length as they were a while ago. And so that opens up a door for developers to be a little bit more conscientious with how long their titles are. And we even see that in the playtime. We looked at lifetime playtime for many different RPGs. A lot of these RPGs were 30, 40, 50, 60-hour games, but we saw like a ceiling of average playtime in the 21 to 25 hours. So that seemed to be, especially for $59, $69 games, kind of almost a Goldilocks zone between 20 to 30 hours is quite a fitting amount of time. Of course, if you're a linear or a wide linear type game, that makes sense. If you're an open world, maybe with your side quests and your stuff, you're pushing 35 to 40 hours. But the core story should probably stay within 18 to 25 hours for those open world titles as well. But there's additional spaces you were mentioning, like with titles like Stray and Miles Morales and Assassin's Creed Mirage, where for a cheaper price, you can't charge $69.99 for these games. I don't think consumers will love that. But if you're in the $40 to $50 space, you can get away with quite shorter games. Like Senua 2 was 8 hours long. And there was some consumers who mentioned that in their reviews, but at Steam right now, it's sitting at a very positive review score. So clearly, it still is being received quite well by consumers despite a short period of time. So even like 8 to 12 hours for a $50 game, like that is quite acceptable in today's ecosystem. And you can really focus on quality hours over quantity of hours in that period.
Yeah, and I guess for this one, do you see it more as a problem for AAA studios? Obviously, the dev times, the costs associated with building a game have scaled considerably over the last couple of decades, the teams involved. But the actual cost of these games don't go up, right? If you look at it marginally with inflation, they really haven't increased that much in the last decade for the amount that the costs have gone up comparatively. So is that part of the reason the market's more competitive, so that's why people are trying to build these longer games? And how do you see that as a contrast against kind of indie or the AA developers? Because I see a lot of them kind of can get away with smaller games or get away with a little bit more of wiggle room in terms of what they're presenting, game quality wise, how they can spin it, and all of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's definitely a massive factor for the AAA space. Their problems are multifold. Like the game length is not the only thing. For example, Spider-Man, the recent Spider-Man is roughly 17 and a half hours of game length, but the leaked production cost was 300 million for that game. So obviously there's a lot of other challenges happening. These 4K graphics assets, like these things are incredibly expensive to develop in even short time frames for content length. So there's a lot more we need to do in the AAA space to bring down these production costs, or at least control for these production costs. But game length is definitely one of those levers they can pull. It's also for the AAA developers a way to test innovation. Because in these major AAA franchises, we're very de-risked. Like we do not want any risk in these. If we're spending 250 million, we need to eliminate any risk. But that means that you're probably losing out on potential innovation. And so these smaller titles that AAA studios can put within their development cycles between releases of major titles provide opportunities for innovation. Like Miles Morales, you mentioned, that didn't do a lot of gameplay innovation, but it did introduce a character that then heavily featured in the next title. And so it's thinking about ways to use smaller, lower risk titles within your development plan to test out innovation, to test out characters, to test out story themes that you can then incorporate into larger franchises down the road. So that's what I would suggest for the AAA developers thinking about it. For the indie developers, I mean, it's less impactful. I agree. I mean, I think they should take indie developers and AA developers coming to the space should take solace in the fact that they don't need to make 30, 40 hours games. They can focus just on making an 8 to 12 hour really solid narrative experience, or if it's an open world experience, then maybe 15 to 30 hours. They don't need to go crazy large with how much content is actually packed in the game. That's not going to drive sales. It's not going to drive reviews. So focus on having a more condensed, higher quality experience, because that's what players are looking for.
Nice. Okay. Moving on to the next trend, because we do need to get through these time. So yeah, Anatomy of Community Management Early Access. I think this is going to be one a lot of people are very interested in. I know Steam opening that up. I think this is a good case for competition, right? A lot of that was driven by itch.io, and then Steam was like, okay, we gotta kind of compete and actually innovate here as well. And I think we've seen a lot of success with early access from a community building point of view. So yeah, what are your thoughts in terms of that? How do you successfully launch an early access campaign, and what has that meant for the industry and for the games market?
Yeah, that's a massive question. I love the question. It's a fun one. I'd break it early access to think about it into a few different types of early access. So when we see in the market, we've listed 5 different types of early access. There are things we call perpetual early access. So this is like Escape from Tarkov, which is basically permanently forever, or Project Zomboid, permanently forever in early access. Usually this is early access used for financing purposes, less for testing the game, more like they need the sales to keep the development of the game going.
Yeah.
Then there's a more standard early access where there's a clear roadmap to launch, and generally a date is set for launch, usually 1 to 2 years out from the start of early access. Then you have partial releases, which is kind of like what Baldur's Gate did. Feature complete game, but we're just going to release a segment of the title to test it out. And then the last two categories are less relevant for indies, but like playtesting betas and incentivized early access. So you're getting 3 days early access to an MMORPG, so you can get ahead of all the other MMO players coming in, right? So those are the different types of early access to establish, and each of them have their own strategies and things to consider when you approach them. I'm guessing for this audience, probably the first two are really the most relevant. There's not a lot of there's no silver bullets here, is really the reality of this. For example, we're on track this year to have 3,000 early access titles released. 3,000 titles on Steam released to early access. This is massive. It's just massive how many titles are coming onto the space and how much competition there is for visibility, much less actual sales within Steam. What I would say, especially for the perpetual early access and the standard early access, I find the most important thing is to make sure that whatever state your game is, players can see the vision for your title. Like when they experience the game, it doesn't have to be feature complete, doesn't have to be visually complete, the assets, but in those initial experiences with the title, they need to be able to see the vision, see where you're headed with this title and be like, yeah, this is the vision. Let me see where you're going. And that's how you'll get commitment out of these players to want to be along for the ride. I think that's the most fundamental piece. And if you can get there, the sooner you can get there, the sooner you can get into the consumer hands, the better you will likely be in the long term.
Yeah, and then do you see a separation between the types of players that play games in early access versus the ones that wait until the full game is out and buy them? A lot of this for me is also coming to mind that, like you said, the early access game is still in some state of incompleteness, may not have the best content loops, may not have as much content as players might expect or want. And how do you see that comparison difference between the types of players that play these games? Would you say early access players are a lot more forgiving in general, or do they also have a lot of demands? I know, at least from one of the studios I used to work with, that they released a game into early access, and then a lot of players were like, "Oh, this game's not worth the price tag," or whatever else. So what is kind of the separation in the types of players and how they interact with these types of games?
Yeah, it's a fun. So unfortunately, the early access player is not a monolith. To give an example, the people who jumped on Pal World, which is technically early access, are not the same group of players who jumped into Project Zomboid or 7 Days to Die or a lot of these titles. There's a lot of play pattern differences between these players and their expectations of what an early access title will be and how likely they are to stick with that title. So unfortunately, the people who engage, there are so many people that engage with early access titles that they're not a monolith and they can't be treated as such. But there is a segment of the market that they seem to be quite engaged and enthusiastic about the idea of engaging early in a development cycle. And this is a group of players that will typically become the foundation that you can build a community upon. And I find for these group of players, what's important to focus on is almost like the non-scalable things about community support. And that's like having your executive producer be in Discord or be in Reddit and chatting with these individuals, people asking questions, sharing their own excitement for the title. Like these things are not scalable. You're not going to have your executive producer asking questions or answering 2,000 questions. But doing these small things, making sure you have a Discord community, making sure you have a Reddit forum, making sure you have all of these foundational blocks for community building, and then authentically engaging with those space, even if it's just 200 people in there when you first launch your early access. That is the foundation which you will build off. Those are your most committed players that will then convince their friends to come and try your game and help boost kind of like your overall potential performance. So I think that's super important.
So yeah, in short, essentially, make sure your game is in at least a good enough state for to satisfy players, and then you find your niche in that and really just build on that and continue to support your game. Hopefully, it goes well.
Yeah,
But yeah,
and I would
no
say
no
maybe not
necessary
even
secret
like
sauce.
it might not even be a
Yeah,
good enough state, but it is basically like it's a state that demonstrates your vision. It might
yeah,
not actually be a good game. In fact, it probably isn't a good game for a lot of the times when it first launches, but people can see like really what is the thing that you think is going to draw them to your game over similar types of play experiences. Like that needs to be clear in what you're doing.
yeah. I think Stardew Valley is like a good example of that, right? It
Mm.
was like a solo developed thing where he built the community throughout updates and posts. We've seen a lot of that in terms of how you build the community, and that game literally just lived and died by that. So I think
Yeah.
that's a good like early example for the model that became early access. And then you had things like Valheim that popped off, and Palworld. Obviously, you have
Mhm.
sort of the one hit wonders in a way, but that's not necessarily the rule.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
Ooh, next one. So future of free to play games on PC and console. This kind of touches back onto live ops a little bit, but is there anything more you want to kind of highlight there in terms of what's happening in the free to play space in PC console? Is that a lot just dependent on mobile or?
So this is specific to PC and console.
Yeah,
Less about talking about mobile. Obviously, mobile is free to play. It'll remain free to play as we look to the future. That's not changing. But in the PC console space, free to play is just it's a massive trap at the moment, to be honest. And I think most folks on here are probably within like the indie AA space who are listening.
yeah.
My honest recommendation would be don't do it. Just don't do it, please.
Stay away.
It is brutal, man. I think like free to play games have two problems, and they're two foundational problems. They have a retention problem, and then they have a conversion problem. Uh, you know, these could be excellent games. Like the finals is a very good game. Its retention has been brutal, brutal. So, and on top of that, let's take the conversion. If you're looking over the last 3 years of free to play releases versus the free to play releases that were older than the last 3 years, the conversion rates for the newer games are roughly half what we're seeing for conversion rates for older titles. And I'll give you an example. I think Marvel's Snap, which is a card game, compared to Hearthstone, which was the more foundational card game in the space. Uh, Hearthstone had roughly a 7.5% conversion rate on PC. Marvel Snap has roughly like a 3.6% conversion rate on PC. That's a
Wow.
massive difference in conversion.
Yeah.
So not only is it difficult to hold on to players for free to play games, it's difficult to convert the ones you do hold on to as well. So it is a very difficult situation for free to play launches.
Yeah, I guess this also kind of goes into the live up space a little bit as well, right? Like it's pretty much a market dominated by the Roblox and Fortnite, and it's going to be a massive sunk cost. I think we saw a lot of games try around the metaverse hype side, and we've had a couple of other ones perpetually be in kind of developmental hell for the last 5-ish years. But yeah, I don't. I also agree. I don't know if this space is really worth entering right now unless you have the massive amounts of money to sink in. I think there's a couple that have perpetually been in development. I'm looking at like Clang, Seed, and all that. Like these things, essentially, you just don't know where they're going to end up. And
Mhm.
to get to a profitable margin right now in this market, I just don't see the business case at this point. Maybe one day, you can get some brands to pull you up, but yeah, it's a very, very hard sort of business case in my mind.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. I would urge significant caution to everyone, to anyone, even AAA, to be totally honest, thinking about bringing a free-to-play title to the market. It is probably the single hardest thing to do is to have a new commercially successful free-to-play title.
Yeah. Well, it's not going to stop it. Like I said, Sony
It's not
coming
gonna
with
stop.
something
No,
in their golden arrow,
no,
right?
no, no.
But yeah, we'll see. And then the exciting one, the next one that I think this audience is really looking forward to, State of Indie and AA. I think we've
Mm,
seen a lot of that this year. We've seen, the big games, Palworld, Helldivers, the ones that are making waves, indies. you don't, and like you said, the AAA state's basically quiet. I think that the big one they're waiting for is GTA next year. But what is the state of indie and AA? What are we seeing there in terms of innovation? What are we seeing there in terms of player engagement and reception? Take it
So
away.
I don't think the innovation is changing. I think the innovation has always been there. Like the indie space has always been really the foundational aspects for a lot of innovation, and the AA space. Don't want to leave them out of the equation. But that has always been like really where you find the most engaging artistic innovation in the space. So I don't think that has changed. I think that has stayed consistent. But what has changed is some of the market dynamics. Largely spurred by the fact that the layoffs we've talked about, part of those layoffs was cancellations of projects and then the teams attached to those projects being laid off. And so a lot of AAA developers are now shrinking to a very few amount of bets on their very core franchises, which means there's going to be a consistently less or a consistently smaller slate of AAA releases as we look to the next 5 years. And so what that means is there's a lot more openings like this year where there's lighter AAA slates and more breathing space for AA and indie titles, which is why we've already seen in 2024 indie and AA in the new game section are making up the majority of revenue share so far throughout the year, which is not something that has happened in the past 2 to 3 years beforehand.
Yeah. Okay. And then kind of on that, do you see there being kind of a change? Because I think I've seen and heard that a lot of AAA studios also now building smaller teams that can kind of focus on AA or smaller games to innovate within the industry. But then even just on the kind of indie and AA side, like you said, we've seen a lot more coming out, and we have probably a lot more studios now that are being opened by a lot of the people that have been laid off within the industry. So do you see in the next couple of years just most of the focus kind of shifting towards indie and AA titles in terms of what's going to be influencing the industry? Obviously, we've seen, like, not that Hades was exactly a small game, but that kind of brought around the whole craze around roguelikes, and then that was a trend for a while. So do you see a lot of that, what was going to be the it game or the it factor it genre coming from the indie and AA space in the next couple of years?
I definitely think you'll see the indie and AA space being like the lead, taking lead on new genres, genre blending, innovations of the space. Absolutely, they'll be the leading candidate, the first person to hit whatever that next genre is, for sure. As you mentioned, there's a lot of from 2021, a lot of new studios started up there. There's a 3 to 5 year development cycle in those studios. Over the next 2 years, we're really going to be seeing the result of those. And it'll be very interesting. A lot of those were on the basis of live service-esque projected business models, which is a concern. But it'll be interesting to see what innovation comes from that crop of new studio startups. I'm quite excited for those. Although I do think, unfortunately, a lot of them might not make the finish line, but I do think a few of them will, and a few of them will bring about some really interesting genre innovation. On the point of AAA developers spinning up kind of smaller studios, I think this is happening less. I think there's a few, there's like NetEase Games, which has been doing some very interesting things. They've started up like 6 different Western studios. So I think there's some outlier AAA publisher types that are trying some more smaller titles in the market. I think a lot of AAA developers are shrinking their product slate and focusing on lower risk, higher upside franchises that they can be more confident in.
Okay, so just doubling down on the IP essentially half the time.
Doubling down on the IP, yeah. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Fair enough. Okay.
Maximizing shareholder value.
Yeah, I can embrace that. But yeah, so moving on to another controversial topic, generative AI. What does it mean for game devs?
Okay, wait. Before we get to Gen AI, one other thing. Let me make because I think this is a good podcast for this. I think the audience is good for this. I do have like a plead. I'm guessing there's probably some VCs and some smaller indie publishers on here. And one thing I do want to plead is have patience with your indie teams. Have patience with your indie teams, and think about the snowball effect within development for smaller teams. And I'll give examples here. Pocket Pair, which are the folks behind Pal World, it took them 3 titles to get to Pal World. Arrowhead Games, who are the folks behind Helldivers 2, it took them 4 games before they got to Helldivers 2. Supergiant Games, it took them 4 games before they got to Hades. And there's many more examples of this I can speak about. So for the folks who are investing in teams and putting the money into these teams and putting trust in these teams, a lot of you, and even the teams themselves, will need to recognize like they're not going to hit big on the first title. They're probably not going to hit big on the second title. There is a snowball effect, though, of building up that knowledge base, that team synergy, building up a community behind these different developer teams. That absolutely does lead to success. And like really the most successful indie studios and the most even AA studios were successful through this snowball effect, not through an overnight release pop-off title. So I really encourage dev teams to think about that and recognize like there is a long pathway here and we need to be patient. And for VCs or publishers of indie teams to also be thinking about that patience as well.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think that's a message that a lot of VCs and investors in the space need to hear. And I think one of the big problems that led us to this was that a lot of people entered the industry without necessarily understanding the game development sort of life cycle. Essentially, when you're looking at it from the outside and you're like, oh, Fortnite's massive, Roblox massive. These are games that have been in development for like 10, 20 years now. So saying, oh yeah, we're going to build the same thing within like 2 years is a little bit optimistic. So I think it's definitely a lesson that I hope a lot of VCs and investors have heard a little bit in terms of what it actually takes to build a game. And I think, a lot of the issue from that has been, especially if you're coming from something like mobile dev as well, you can't apply the same development cycles to PC console that you can with mobile.
100%.
So hopefully there's been some, I guess, insight into what it takes to build a game. I think we could go into the whole Google and Amazon of it in terms of how they've supported their own ventures into games. But yeah, it is definitely something I think that the community here at least would appreciate a lot. And hopefully we're going to see a lot more of that from the investor side as well. But the one thing that I guess you could say is maybe going to help accelerate some of this and enable smaller teams to use faster is the Gen AI component, right? But like,
nice segue.
What are your thoughts on Gen AI in games? Is it still the big threat everyone thought, or is it more just enabling smaller teams to achieve more in a faster amount of time? And I guess the flip side.
Ain't that the $1 million question? Oh, yeah, that is. I mean, that really is the big question at the moment, and one focus on everybody. I mean, so on a positive perspective, over the last year or 2 years, we've seen some pretty crazy developments on different sides of generative AI. Things in like video generation. There was Sora from OpenAI, which is now creating like quite solid HD videos with realistic models. You can project a future where you can build cutscenes using where small teams can build cutscenes using something like that. We've seen music generation products come in, Suno, SoundDraw. They're doing immersive, reactive music for games. So things that change your soundtrack based on the experience of the players. Cool idea, cool application. We've seen on-device processing now coming into this place. So moving the actual AI processing out of the cloud and onto the device, which saves a lot of time, saves latency, which is obviously super important within gaming applications. A lot of drawbacks there, but you can project a future where that's really interesting and has a lot of gaming benefits. So there's a lot of really interesting theoretical areas in which AI can be applied within gaming. I think there's going to be a massive schism between the large AAA studios and the smaller indie teams. That is the reality of the capitalistic society in which we live within. Unfortunately, it's typically the big folks that benefit the most from new technology. And in this case, the reality is AAA studios are going to have the capabilities to build their own in-house Gen AI models, which will protect them from legal liability around copyright infringement for training models. It'll also allow them to be more more precise with the output of their model to match their art styles, to match their whatever it is that they want to align their titles with. They're going to be more in line for their Gen AI models, whereas the little folks, the indie developers and the AA developers are going to be reliant on third-party vendor AI solutions. And that opens up a really big can of worms because generative AI is incredibly expensive. like this stuff right now is wildly expensive. To give like an example, ChatGPT, I can't remember if it was officially reported or if it got leaked, but they have a daily operating cost of $700,000 just for ChatGPT. Like these are massive, like Stability AI. They're another massive AI company. They're close to insolvency with over $100 million in bills just to cloud computing providers. Like these are very expensive, and so you as an indie developer or AA developer, you're doing your vendor planning, you're making partnerships with these AI vendors. You need to be very careful because there's a very good chance many of these AI developers will not see the next year because their revenue model, their cash burn rate, is not sustainable. So be very careful about the partners you choose in this space.
And I guess that's also not really cracking up the worm of copyright infringement and anything that goes on the legal side as this field develops even more. So maybe a can left untouched or left to very specific use cases. I think for me, the one that from a marketing side I find the most interesting is just creative iteration more than anything else. When you have your own creatives, when you know what's working on the marketing side, it's a good way to test copy. It's a good way to test your creatives and like variations within that. Because I know a lot of time that we spent when I was doing UA was literally just like, we have this one creative, we need to make 10 copies of that essentially with minor adjustments. I think something like Gen AI is really good for that. But yeah, I think definitely if you're going into space, definitely understand what you're using it for, and I'd still say keep human interaction as the kind of main contributor to whatever you're doing, just to avoid any later legal ramifications at this stage.
Yeah,
But
absolutely.
yeah, I mean that's I think true for like any new space. When it comes out, you always have a little bit of an adjustment period before we get anywhere, and I think the smaller players definitely have less when it comes to legal and even just time and money and space to be able to understand everything that's going on in the space.
Yep.
Yeah, that's good. And then I think this is probably a little bit less relevant for this audience, but we can quickly touch upon it. UGC, is that still going strong? Do you still think that's going to be the driving factor? I know obviously the youngest generations, they're very used to now Roblox, Fortnite, having that creative space, having that kind of input into games. I think indie studios can still get away with kind of more linear and closed off paths, whereas I guess with the bigger ones and especially with the younger audiences that are now being exposed to games, do they almost have, I guess, some kind of understanding or some kind of thing that the games that they want to play need to have these kind of UGC content loops, or do you not see that being necessarily as much of a thing?
Yeah, we haven't seen play patterns where the existence of UGC is required for these users. I mean, the reality is there is a massive chunk of 8 to 12-year-olds ish that are just playing Roblox. Like all they play is Roblox. And this group of players, this massive chunk of players, and growing as more people age into this category, are going to go through a maturity curve, and they're probably going to exit Roblox. But they're probably going to mature out of Roblox. And what play expectations they have as they mature through their gaming curve, we don't know, to be totally honest. I wish I knew. I would quit my job and start developing whatever I think that is at the moment. I don't know. I don't have that answer. But I know if we're asking like questions of how do we disrupt the hierarchy of current live service titles, it'll probably be this. It'll be these group of players, these large group of players who are raised on Roblox and to a lesser extent Fortnite, coming into the market and looking for what is their next play experience and not seeing it in the existing live service titles. That'll probably be where we see evolution in those live service titles and potentially new live service titles that capture those audiences better. Will those be UGC driven platforms? They'll probably have some element of UGC in them. We do see with the consumer research around this that a lot of these players like that self-expression, they like that building, they like the social aspects that a lot of these platforms are able to deliver on. So there does seem to be some core elements within these platforms and these play expectations that'll probably carry on. The other way I think about UGC as well, this is my own personal fascination, but I think when you look historically, like UGC is not new. I always love when people talk about UGC as if it's some new concept, and I'm like, where have you been for the past 2 decades? Did you never play Warcraft? Like, what are you doing? But UGC has been around forever, and
yes,
UGC historically has done 2 things. It's driven more engagement for the title that it has, and it's very good at that. And it's been a breeding ground for new genres. To give some examples, the whole MOBA genre was birthed from Dota, the Warcraft mod. The whole battle royale genre started as a mod in Minecraft. A Hunger Games mod in Minecraft was the foundation for that genre. And there are more examples of this. So if we look at the history of UGC, those are the 2 main ways UGC has impacted the space so far. And so as we look out to the future, my expectation is that will still stay the same. Games can drive more engagement with their titles if they feature some type of modding capability or UGC elements where it makes sense. Not all games are built for UGC. Counter-Strike doesn't necessarily need a UGC element to it. But also, people should be looking to the play experiences in Roblox and the play experiences in UEFN and other games that have UGC. Like, are there interesting play experiences that are cropping up in these games that maybe could be expanded upon into like a full-fledged title? So look at these genres, these UGC titles for inspiration for play experiences to pull out of those types of games.
Fair enough. So in short, bring back metaverse and interoperability for the future, right?
As long as it's not on the blockchain, I'm okay with the metaverse coming back. I'm okay with it.
Well, I mean, it is, like you said, it's just a marketing term, right? UGC has been around forever. A lot of this was just a hype train that people wanted money for, essentially, more than anything else. I don't think it changes anything outside of that. No, but cool. So I agree. I think there is definitely space in terms of looking at innovation, and you've seen a lot of studios now just pop up on Roblox, right? A lot of kids are also making obscene amounts of money from building games on Roblox. So the future of game dev, right there. Okay. But yeah, going on to, so I think I just briefly also, before we jump into the biz dev side, wanted to quickly touch on a couple of the special focus topics that you guys also look in, specifically the Steam discounting strategies. Because I know that was a big part of play when I worked in an indie studio. Steam discounting, especially when we're coming to summer sale, looking at different elements, essentially, was a great way to get our game visibility, was a great way to convert some of those wish list titles. I think a lot of people, and I think it's a trend, I don't know if it's shifted, because I feel like, at least this year, from what I saw in the summer sale, it was a little bit less active than what it's been in the past. Maybe that's just me as a player. But there's definitely been, I think, some shifts in terms of visibility on Steam, especially now that you have, PlayStation exclusives coming out. It's become a little bit even harder to get into these sales and be visible in them. So yeah, what do you see in terms of the Steam discount strategies, leveraging that for visibility mostly, especially for indies and smaller players?
Yeah, it's a super important topic. One thing we look at, so to understand the foundation for a lot of this analysis, is we have a BI store platform that actually ingests a lot of actual Steam revenue actuals from a lot of our partners. And we're taking on our partners, so there's a sales pitch for you. But as a result of that, we have a lot of actuals that we can do kind of more aggregated analysis on for promotion efficacy. And so a couple different things. One, consistently over the last 6 years, we've seen Steam promotions getting more and more effective at driving both unit sales and driving uplift in revenue. So the expected uplift in revenue has actually been getting better over the last 6 years. It's up 45% from 2018, just to give you an example. So on a macro perspective, Steam discounts are getting more effective at driving revenue. So it makes it even more important to understand your Steam discounting strategy and be very thoughtful in your approach. You mentioned the different promotion types in the windows. Part of the analysis we did actually really backs up what you're saying, especially around those kind of global promotions. We evaluated a bunch of different promotion types, and those global promotions tended to perform the worst of all of them when it comes to both unit sales uplift and revenue uplift in those periods for those titles. I think the reason is quite simple. The visibility, as you mentioned, is brutal. Like it's just having people see that you have a game discounted, much less actually having them purchase your game, is incredibly difficult during a winter sale. I will note that there's the seasonal sales, like the winter sales, and then there's the themed sales, like the RPG sales. The theme sales actually tend to perform better than the seasonal promotions. I think the reason there is people know what they're looking for. Like if it's an RPG sale, like you're going to get RPG players going like, oh yeah, like what do I want to see in there? With a global promotion, it's just a massive smorgasbord of whatever is out there, right? So if you're planning and you want to index more to one type of promotion, I would lean towards themed over seasonal, at least for those big global promotions. Outside of that, an interesting couple strategies we've seen are people using week-long promotions ahead of the global promotions. So if this weekend there was a global promotion about to start, I'm actually going to run my week-long promotion this week before that global promotion hits. And we've actually seen week-long promotions tend to outperform those global promotions. So there's a logic there trying to boost your visibility and get out ahead of that tidal wave of sales coming in.
Yeah,
The other thing I'll quickly add.
Already, sorry.
Go for it.
I was just going to say, I guess people are already kind of gearing up to spend money. They know when the seasonal ones are there. So if you've just got visibility, you can be like, oh, like I can just buy this game ahead of the curve a little bit. I already set aside like £100 for the sale or something. Adding like £5 to this indie is not going to change much. Yeah.
Or if it's on your wish list, right? Like if for the people who have it on your wish list, it'll pop up that, hey, your wish list is on sale before when the weekend hits, and it's like actually these 12 titles on your wish list are now on sale, right? So from a wish list conversion perspective, you're getting out ahead of it as well. And then also interesting to note, we've seen quite a few people doing launch discounts as well. So typically like a 10% launch discount. And we've seen those actually have been quite effective. They help with visibility, although that's a bit on the downturn, but they still do help with visibility. And they do seem to have quite a strong impact on both revenue and unit sales for what is a very small discount, 10%, quite small.
Yeah, I guess essentially playing into like the day one launch kind of thing.
Exactly.
Get as many people in the initial lift off. Okay, no, cool. So yeah, I think it is a little bit of trial and error with Steam as usual. Just gotta try and figure your way around that one and hope you click. But I think that's really useful. I think especially the, like you said, the pre-seasonal one and getting to know that, seasonal sales aren't necessarily what they used to be in terms of visibility and discoverability, and like you should be targeting more specifically for the audience that you want, which requires you to know the audience that you want in the first place. But no, I think that's definitely a really good takeaway for people that plays into, I guess, their Steam strategy, which I think, especially for indies and smaller AA's, is usually massive, right? It's still the biggest platform on PC. On that, one thing, and this is more of a side note, looking into what I've been seeing on mobile, do you think we'll ever get to a point where we're going to see a similar shift in PC console, where the platform holders are going to have a little bit more of a control on their powers? I mean, a lot of what happened in mobile in terms of the platforms charging 30%, a lot of that's coming from platforms like Steam, right? So a lot of those measures could be said to be a little anti-competitive at times, especially if they're gatekept by these platforms. But do you ever see that coming into a check, or do you still think PC's not going to be touched?
I don't think Steam will have to face the same regulation that Apple and Google are, because they don't own the platforms. They don't own like the PC platform in the same way that Apple owns the hardware and Google owns the hardware. So they're a bit protected from the legal challenges. As far as like a storefront challenge, I really don't. I really don't think we're going to see a world where Steam is sufficiently challenged as a storefront to the point where they need to adjust their storefront-free strategy. Like we've seen this battle play out. Epic Games, of course, is the most recent challenger, and Epic, they released their 2023 Epic Games Store Rewind infographic, and within that they had around 300 million revenue in third-party sales on their store for the year, which candidly, and that was down 13%, I think is what it said. So that is candidly, like that is relative to what Steam does in a year. That is, we're talking pennies, right? Really the only challenges maybe you could see is like Microsoft coming in. You can only get the Game Pass through the Microsoft Store. Can they now have BattleNet with their acquisition of Activision? Like, can you squint and see a pathway there for Microsoft to challenge? I don't think so, and I don't even know if they'll take on that battle, to be honest. So
probably not right now. I don't think that's the strategy.
Definitely not right now. Yes, yeah. So I think it's very hard to project a future where Steam is not king of PC distribution.
Steam is still safe. Steam is still the platform to go to, everyone. The main thing to take away, I guess. Before we, I think we do need to switch to biz dev, but I do quickly just want to touch on transmedia and IP. What would be your advice to kind of the smaller players in terms of IP? I think a lot of developers coming in first time. How important do you think IP is for them in terms of, when you're publishing your first few games, when you're looking at that? In terms of transmedia, I don't think that's something indie players necessarily have the funds or support to a lot of times look towards. But is it still important, would you say, to try and keep your IP as close as possible? Or what do you think the benefit is there for indie and smaller players?
There's obviously a financial reality for transmedia strategy for these folks that is probably out of reach. I mean, IP definitely is important, but at the end of the day, I don't think it's what's going to make or break a business for an indie or a AAA developer. Like we spoke about those, the four I referenced earlier. Yeah. None of them, they all have multiple titles, but for the most part, almost all of them were building a new IP with each consecutive title that they were releasing. They weren't doing some snowball effect on IP. And so I think for people within that indie to lower AA, single A, whatever classification we want to say, I don't think a focus on IP makes the most sense. This is more for AA and single A. The only other thing I'll add is anime and video game anime crossover has been very effective. And that is financially a bit more viable for smaller companies and smaller IP. So that's an interesting pathway. Like we saw in our consumer research, I think it was roughly for under 25-year-old gamers, 30% of them view watching anime as a favorite activity, as a favorite hobby. So there is that Venn diagram of people who like anime and people who like games. I know who, and I'm talking to Jay. I'm speaking your language. I know I can play to my crowd. I think there's a really good business case for the gaming anime.
Yeah, if you're within the subculture, as you mentioned.
Yeah, the subculture.
Yes. Those who know, as you said. No, I think that has been, I think, a pretty big change as well, right? Like anime becoming mainstream alongside games. I know I eventually want to get an anime producer onto this podcast as well. I met in Japan who did a lot of the transmedia and cross IP things. And I've seen a lot, especially both America, Europe, like a lot of developers. And even when I was visiting kind of Korea and Japan, a lot of developers are looking to make themed games around sort of Japanese elements or Korean elements, looking at kind of animation in that way, like Studio Ghibli and all this stuff. There's so many like Ghibli-esque games, comfy games, like you said, that borrow from a lot of that art style and visual style that have had a lot of success. And I think a lot of people in the dev space, especially here that I know because of my own personal interests, are definitely looking to build games in that space.
Yes.
So definitely a growing field, and I'm glad to hear that hopefully is going to continue.
100%.
Let's see. Awesome. And then I guess this is a good part to semi-transition to bit more the biz dev side, but kind of on that, before we get specifically into your tips on biz dev, I wanted to know, you've obviously done a lot of conference speeches this year. You've been networking at a lot of events globally. What are your kind of key takeaways in terms of doing business in different parts of the world? What do you see when you go to Asia, Europe, America? How do you prepare yourself when you're looking at different industries? What is sort of the takeaway in terms of doing business on a global level?
That's a really interesting question. So within like US and Europe, I think a lot of that business development strategy is fairly standardized. Like there's nothing outside of the tips we'll get into in a second. I think a lot of that stuff is standard. I've been lucky enough to work with quite a few Japanese and Korean developers as well, and of course have been to those markets to meet in person with them. Japan is quite unique. I think there's a few things Japan that I would highlight. Japan really appreciates in-person meetings and gestures of like actually wanting to engage with their companies. Like just the mere fact that we go to Japan and meet with the developers face to face. There's no business pretense necessarily. It is just our interest in engaging directly with them, meeting them face to face, giving them a presentation, no cost, no charging or anything like that. Like that actually means a lot, and then from my experience means more than when you do so with Western developers. And it's still great to do, but for Japanese developers, they seem to appreciate and value that type of in-person relationship development quite a bit more. There are several traditions around Japanese business that you should look into and be prepared to observe. I won't get into that nuance. But the other thing also, there's a gifting culture in Japanese business. So it's always fun to, if you're going to go to Japan, bring some small gifts that, especially even small gifts like that represent the country in which your company is from, is super appreciated, and share them with whoever you're meeting at the end of the meeting as well. So small things like that, those small gestures, I find mean a lot in building relationships within Japan. Korea is a bit more of a blend, I find, a bit of a blend between some of the East Asian style traditions and the more Western style traditions. I think it's still, again, very important to go face to face in those markets. But there's a bit more of a Western vibe in doing business development in Korea, I find. There is still quite a hierarchical nature within Korea as well. And you feel that if you're in a room with like a VP and an analyst, how interactions play out in a room like that will be probably quite different than a similar situation in a European company, for example. So there's a lot of unique aspects in there, but it's a lot of fun, and I highly recommend if you have the opportunity, definitely take it up and do it.
Yeah. And also take business cards. Business cards
That's
are
a great
your friend in
point.
these places.
That's a great point. Yeah, especially in Japan, business cards are definitely important. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, nice. And then I guess going into the mainstream of the actual biz dev part. So talk me through your approach. How do you build a relationship, whether that's online or in person? Obviously, we can tackle them separately. But what's your approach to getting to that $1 million new business venture side of things?
So I would say when we're looking at this, there's some consistent trends. Even if you're me selling data, if you're someone at, say, TransPerfect selling localization, if you're someone at i3D selling backend software support, I think that's what they do. There's some consistent things in there. And I think one of the most core elements of business development, especially in the games space, is focusing on building trust. Because regardless of what you do, what you're selling to, the likelihood is the number of people who have purchasing decision on what you're selling or what you're trying to BD around is probably quite small. There's not that many companies in this games industry. It's not like other sales industry. Like if you're Cisco, there's thousands of companies that need software infrastructure, right? Like it's a very small buying pool for the games industry, regardless of the type of service you're selling. And so that's why I always encourage people to focus on a long-term perspective and building trust over trying to focus on just sales. And building trust, there's a few different ways that I like to do this. And I'll give three. The first is do your homework. Do your homework. So when you come into a conversation with somebody, you need to know as much as you can about their business, how their business is performing, what are their plans for the future, like everything you can. What is this person's role? What are they likely responsible for? You need to do your homework and demonstrate to the person you're meeting with, like, hey, I know your business. I understand. You don't need to explain these things to me. Like, we can speak as peers because I've put in the research and the effort to understand, and I have a specific goal in why I'm reaching out to you and want to speak with you. So that's the first one. The second is, I call it kind of like doing the little things. So this can be, as an example, if we're about to release like an insights post, like Newzoo, we're known for our insights posts. Sometimes what I'll do is share that insights post ahead of our public release with a key contact that I have, and it'll be like, hey, can you take a look at this? Do you find this interesting? What's your thoughts? Get your feedback. People love that. People love being engaged in that process, feeling like they're getting some exclusivity from it. And it engages them, gets some feedback, and you start building trust with them. You build a relationship with them. And then the last piece that I'd recommend is transparency. I think transparency, arguably probably the most important part of trust, is being transparent with the person that you're trying to build that relationship with. And this can come in many different forms. It can be something as simple as being willing to tell them that a certain sale thing is not good for them, does not have good ROI. Like, I was scoping a project with a developer. They were interested in a bigger TAM sizing approach. And I actually suggested to them, like, I don't think this is good. I think for the cost that we would need to charge you, I don't think you'll get enough of an ROI on this piece of work. And we actually landed on doing a very small little piece of work for them that would have a much larger relative impact for a much lower cost. And in that moment, one could say, I was a poor salesperson. I lost theoretical money for us. But what I gained was a much stronger relationship with this individual because I was very transparent. Like, I don't think this thing is going to do what you hope it will and provide that ROI. So it's that prioritizing transparency, prioritizing being open with a person over prioritizing the short-term sale. It might not make you popular with your commercial director or your sales manager or whoever, but I think in the long run, given that there's such a small pool of potential purchasers within this industry, that is the winning formula.
Yeah, I agree. I think transparency, that last point, is really crucial. Like, this is a very small industry, right? Like, everyone kind of knows everyone, especially with in this podcast mostly going to go to the UK games industry. Everyone's a developer, right? And everyone in London kind of knows who each other are. So, if you are doing some shady business, or not having everyone's interests the best of heart, it's going to get around. Everyone's going to find out. Having a good reputation really, really matters in this industry. I think that can't be stated enough. Like, you live and die by your reputation in the connection space here. And especially if you're doing biz dev, that's going to be crucial to get that step right. So no, I absolutely agree. And I think, like you said, it pays dividends in the future. You may not have the immediate, like, current payoff. But building that relationship, that's going to get you places in the future. It's going to build your network and reputation. And that's going to lead to, better word of mouth. It's going to spread to other people when you go to events and things like that. It's going to lead to a lot better introductions and presence for you there. So definitely keep that in mind. I guess shifting a little bit to more, how do you do this in a live networking event? How do you, when you're going to like a games industry meetup, when you're going to a conference, what's your approach? Is there value in just organizing the meet to match meetings every day, running around from hotels, or is it the more natural, you just go speak to developers, speak to people? Like, what's your approach in person when you're trying to build these relationships?
Yeah, this is a funny one for me because I'm a massive introvert. Like, I'm terrified of like being a self-starter in conversations and stuff. You're not going to see me being like the social butterfly running around from groups to groups. I really got to force myself in those circumstances. So this is not my strong suit, I will say. I do think there's value in the meet to match side of things, and it depends on what your business model is and what type of relationships, who you're trying to make connections with. For me, I find I've rarely done significant business at in-person events, but what I have done is just casual relationship building quite a lot of the time. I think into today's environment, you don't have a lot of opportunity just for a casual in-person conversation, which I find can be super helpful for building a long-term relationships with people. And that's what events provide for me, is an opportunity just to sit down with a person that maybe we've had a couple Zoom calls with, some very boring Zoom calls talking about data and all this kind of stuff, right? And like we can sit down, two
Yeah.
people, chat about games, because that's really the unifying reality for a lot of us, is our love of this industry. And so that's how I view events. It's just an opportunity for me to connect with the people that we've had a work relationship with, but now we can at least get to know each other a little bit better, either at like a meetup party or a one-on-one coffee chat. That is how I view events. I don't view it as a business driver. I view it as a relationship driver and a network builder.
I think events are great for the relationship building. They're great to just go nerd out with everyone in the industry, talk about games, and be like, hey, we're here because we love this industry. We're here because we like playing games. And it's just a good way to meet other people and actually see this person, like you said, online. If you're discussing business, it's like very impersonal, and then when you actually get to meet in person, it's like there's a person behind this, and you can also learn a lot about them, their problems, and it can lead to new business. It can lead to new business ideas and avenues, because things just come out naturally when you're just chatting. That you're like, oh,
Mhm.
actually, you didn't ask about this, but we can actually help with something like that if that's a problem for you. And I've seen that happen so many times where it's like just having that relationship, building it into like essentially a friendship, and building that network really pays off like dividends. And that's for me the biggest sort of benefit of being at these live events. On kind of the flip side, so we've gone into some of the top tips for what to do. As a business developer, what pisses you off, or what do you see when people just do BD in the wrong way? What is it when you go to an event or you meet a person and you're just like, this is not how you do business? Like, for the love of God, guys, please just stop doing this. Because I think a lot of people that listen to this, a lot of the image of business developers, marketers, and all of that in
Yeah.
the industry is very just like, these guys just want money. They don't care about the art. They don't care about the game. Yeah, what are
Yeah.
the pain points of business development that you see in the industry?
I mean, the most fundamental point of frustration for me is people who don't research the company or the person they're reaching out to. Like I work at a data vendor, like a data market research firm. If you're a localization selling BD and you're reaching out to me for a meeting at a conference, I'm going, what are you doing? Why are you wasting your time sending this message to me? I'm not going to buy localization. I don't make games. So what are you doing? Like, and it's this lack of thought, sales outreach, that I think is so frustrating to see. And I think for many people, it just tunes them off of any sales outreach whatsoever, very understandably. Um, so people need to be very conscientious with how they do their outbound messaging and actually put the time in to put the research into who you should be reaching out to. Find the people where you can actually make a positive impact on their work with what you're selling, and reach out to them specifically. This isn't an industry of scalable sales where you can cold call 1,000 people and you'll get a conversion rate of 2%, right? Like that's not how you approach sales in the industry. And it drives me crazy when I see salespeople taking that approach. Usually it's people out of industry bringing sales into the games industry selling. I think that's my biggest pet peeve, at least the one that's jumping to my mind at the
No, fair
moment.
enough.
Yeah.
No, I agree. I think it's a message of quality rather than quantity. I think a lot of times, a lot of what I guess a typical sales view is, especially for people that don't necessarily do that or have come from outside of the industry where they have a lot more exposure, and it's more, at the end of the day, a lot of that stuff is just, we need to get targets, we need to hit targets. A lot of time that becomes more just send to everyone, just quantity, don't really care. But like we discussed, this is a very interpersonal industry. This is a very small and very connected industry, and by doing that, you're really just going to turn people off. So definitely quality is a key factor when you're trying to build these relationships and outreach, and a lot of that comes from knowing who you're talking to and why you're talking to them. I've had a number of both LinkedIn requests and even at Gamescom next week, so many people are reaching out being like, oh yeah, I have this like studio or this AI thing or this thing that might be helpful, maybe, I don't know why, but I just want to hit everybody that comes on my suggested list on these platforms. It's like, yeah, that's not really, I don't see the point of that. And I think, like you said, that'll turn a lot of people off.
It'll do
So
the
definitely
opposite.
want to be
It'll
careful.
do the opposite. Yeah.
Yeah. I know I don't want to necessarily speak to those people or do business with those people if that's how they approach me. So I think that's a very good lesson for people when they're first starting out, especially looking at biz dev. Whether you're an indie trying to reach a publisher, do your research. Do your research into who this publisher is or who you're trying to get investment from. You can, I mean, there's so many tools out there that you can look into in terms of, does this publisher support my type of game? Is there somebody who is going to align with what my game's mission or vision is? So really know who you're trying to reach out to and why. Have a purpose for reaching out to people. I think it's great if you go naturally to events and just form relationships without necessarily. I think if you don't have a specific goal in mind, that actually is better, especially for a lot of like nerds and introverts like us. I think we're terrible at having the like stone cold faces and being like, yeah, I have to get something. I need to get something out of this. Nah, I think it's much better, and you end up better off if you go into it just more authentic, more simple, without the stress. And yeah, on that, I guess one of the last things I did want to discuss with you, because I've seen a lot of this impact young developers and even people that have been in the industry for a while. But it's imposter syndrome. I think we all essentially suffer from that. As somebody who's like quite often on stage, on podcasts like these, representing essentially the whole industry in a way, how do you deal with imposter syndrome? What is your like take on that?
Poorly. Yeah, that's a great question. Man, how do I deal with imposter syndrome? So at first I established that I feel it every day. I feel it now. I'll feel it tomorrow, and I'll feel it next week at Gamescom.
I mean, I'm with you.
It's always there, and we all got it, and we're all there. I think for me, it's sort of, I kind of, cheesy, but I sort of have like a North Star. Like, my North Star is I love games, and I want to do what I can to be a part and improve this industry. Like, I love this industry. I want to be a part of it, and I want to improve it. And that's my goal. Like, and I think for me, a lot of people in this industry share that North Star. And as long as I try to stay true to that in what I'm doing and engaging in these podcasts, and when I go on talks, and if I feel like I'm being honest, I'm not lying, I'm not trying to be cheeseball, slimy car salesperson, I'm just engaging within the space, sharing interesting things, having a great conversation. That for me kind of helps mitigate it. It's like, it helps me feel like I'm just authentically engaging within the space, like, and less focused on like, do I have the right to speak about the space? Do I have enough experience and years in the industry and the right thoughts and all that kind of stuff? Like, those things go away a bit. And I'm just like, no, I'm just talking about games. I love games. I want to be a part of this industry, and I want to help. And I think other people recognize that and engage and appreciate that as well, because they see it in themselves.
Yeah, absolutely true. I think it's just definitely, especially when you're on stage and things, I always feel a little bit of the nerves and be like,
yes,
why am I speaking? I don't know shit, guys.
Yeah.
I'm just making this stuff up as I go along half the time. But yeah, no, I think part of it is just recognizing that other people, I think, eventually respect you and come listen to you and actually find something useful from that, and that helps. Do you think it gets easier with time, or is it still a constant battle every day for you?
I think it's been fairly consistently a battle for me. Maybe we check in again in 5 years. We'll do this podcast again, and we'll see if both of us have improved on our imposter syndrome. But I think it's regularly been a battle. Who knows? Maybe it'll change.
Yeah.
I don't plan to go anywhere, so we'll see.
No, I mean, I'm right there with you, and I hope that offers some solace to all the listeners, because it's something I've spoken to a lot of people about, and a lot of them just like, I don't know. I think that's one of the biggest things that holds a lot of people back from either reaching out to others to trying things, is just that they just don't feel like they've earned it in a way. And I think that is a mindset that you just kind of need to overcome. I think when you're in a place like the games industry, and especially with it becoming so competitive, you never get anything you don't ask for. And one of the main ways that you grow is by pushing yourself. So I absolutely encourage everyone to do that. And I mean, as you heard from Devan, me as well, like imposter syndrome is absolutely something that I face every day, that you face every day, and it's going to always be there. You just have to stop it from immobilizing you, stop it from like just making you pause there. So yeah, hopefully that helps in terms of a basic business understanding. And obviously, if you have any more questions, you can try and reach out to Devan. Devan, where can people find you?
I guess probably LinkedIn will probably be the best place to reach me. Devan Brennan. Honestly, if there are people who are new in sales in the industry and they want to just have a conversation, there are people who are just looking to chat about the industry as a whole. I was going to say shoot the S, but I don't know if I should swear on podcasts yet. But if people just want to chat,
we're all adults here.
That's true. If you want to shoot the shit about games, I absolutely love doing that. So feel free to just reach out. And more than happy to plan a time to have a quick chat.
Yep, absolutely recommend reaching out to Devan. Really cool guy. And well, I mean, by the time this podcast is out, it'll be too late. But he's going to have a talk at DevCon next week. So I hope that goes well, and I'll catch you at the event. It's going to be great. But yeah, I guess before we close, one last question that I kind of want to make a closing tradition on this podcast series, at least, is: do you think it's enough in this market just to have a good game? Is it enough to just have a good idea, a good gameplay loop? Is that enough for you to get a successful game in the market these days?
I loved it. I mean, I'm not sure it has ever been enough in today's market to just have a good gameplay loop. So I think the sad answer is probably no. It probably never has been enough. But how do I put a positive spin on this one? Oh, you're really testing my consulting capabilities. I think, is it enough in the short term? Probably not. But is it a foundation that you can build upon for the long term? Is it how you get to a Hades? Is it how you get to a Helldivers? Absolutely. It is the first step, let's say, to having a commercially successful game. That is what I would say. It's the first step.
Nice political answer there. I think you saved yourself. Consult another day now.
Nice.
But no, thanks. Thanks so much for joining me, Devan. I'm really glad to have had this. It's the first opening podcast of the series with you. It's been super informative for me as well, and I think for a lot of the people listening, they'll have learned a lot about you, about Newzoo. And yeah, absolutely do reach out. I think, if nothing else, the free insights that they offer are always a good thing for the indie devs. Definitely supports it. So a lot of what we've discussed comes from their free reports. So go give that a download on the Newzoo site. And yeah, thank you for joining the first episode of Growing Pains. It's been an absolute pleasure to host you, Devan. Always fun to chat about games. I definitely can't wait for another catch up at Gamescom next week. And yeah, very smart, very capable person. So just wanted to say thanks for all the knowledge and everything that you've offered us.
And ditto to you as well, Jay. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and be on your podcast, especially for the first episode. It's an absolute honor. I've already learned a lot from working with you in the past, and I'm looking forward to continuing. Hopefully, maybe our paths cross again at a company someday. But in the meantime, thanks for having me on the podcast. This was a lot of fun.